scheming reptilian shapeshifters in human disguises, infiltrating the highest levels of corporate and political power, ruling us from another dimension and feeding off to suppress your true potential. David Icke, conspiracy theorist and spiritual thought leader who's now reached near religious fame, has always been a guy I enjoyed listening to but often disagree with. I mean, he was right about a few things, like the Federal Reserve banking cartel, the way corporate and political powers are equally an enemy, and how our universe may very well be a holographic matrix, which is now a mainstream scientific theory debated by top physicists. But one of the theories that has always left me scratching my head was David's reptilian theory. I've listened to his seminars on this subject and always felt like there was insufficient evidence to prove it. I concluded that maybe David has just run out of things to say after over 2 decades of spiritual epiphanies. Maybe his best days were behind him, and this reptilian stuff was just a fraud designed to keep generating new material for his books and world tours, which every year David always seems to come up with enough new epiphanies as material to fill up an entire book. But recently, in the past few months, I've stumbled across some very interesting information that might actually prove David Icke's reptilian theory, or at the least prove that he was onto something when he came up with it. Now, keep in mind, I'm the guy who made a video debunking some of the reptilian theory stuff. One of my videos has over 120,000 views, and although it doesn't specifically discuss David's version of the reptilian conspiracy, it does talk about another similar version. You can click right here to watch that video in a separate window. So, for a guy who recently debunked some of this reptilian nonsense, what the hell am I doing making a video in defense of it? Well, one of the startling and sobering facts I discovered is that on a biological and psychological level, reptilian themes are actually very much a part of the current scientific literature. Yes, that's right. Reptilian concepts have been a part of the medical and scientific community for decades, but few people know about it or even connect it to David's work. It turns out, evolutionary biology proves that humans evolved from reptiles and fish. This is a pretty well-known fact, but in recent years, research has found astounding evidence that proves that our reptilian ancestry is much closer to our day-to-day lives than we think. How close? Well, it's actually inside your brain right now. Now, before you freak out, just know that this is entirely normal. It's called the R complex, or reptilian complex. That's right, they even call it reptilian. Scientific research proves that our current human brains can be divided into 3 separate brains. The 3-brain model is called the triune brain. It was proposed by American physician and neuroscientist Paul D. MacLean as a way of looking at the human brain from an evolutionary perspective. The first brain is called the R complex, or reptilian complex. This is the most primitive part of the brain, and it's also the oldest. The reptilian brain is responsible for some of the most basic and primitive aspects of human biology, like fear, instinct, hunger, fight or flight response, etc. In fact, the R complex is also associated with the amygdala, which is the brain's fear response center. In essence, the R complex is understood as being the oldest part of the human brain, going back to our ancient past having evolved out of fish and reptiles. Because evolution is a gradual cumulative process, the reptilian brain is still part of our biology, but now the brain has evolved to include the latest installments, known as the paleomammalian complex and the neomammalian complex. Basically, we have a lizard brain in our heads, and our entire lives are fundamentally based on these reptilian biological influences, whether we like it or not. But our human connection to reptiles extends beyond the confines of our brains. One of the creepiest things I've ever seen are pictures of a human embryo in its early stages, because by day 28, the embryo already begins to exhibit certain qualities that look like lizards, but also can be biologically categorized as such. You can see a tail-like portion near the bottom. Some researchers claim that upon closer observation you can actually see gills like on a fish on the embryo. Even Carl Sagan, famous astronomer and astrophysicist, in his book The Dragons of Eden, wrote, "It does no good whatsoever to ignore the reptilian component of human nature, particularly our ritualistic and hierarchical behavior. On the contrary, the model may help us understand what human beings are all about." What we see here is a startling correlation between our modern human biology and our reptilian evolutionary past. The worst part, however, is that the reptilian brain is responsible for some of the most destructive, violent impulses, things like aggression, dominance, territoriality, and ritual displays. All the modern manifestations of these are obvious today. We live in a world full of war and violence, centralized greed and narcissism, deception for power, and so much more. The scarier part, however, might be how the reptilian brain matches the same qualities David Icke uses to describe the evil, shape-shifting reptilians who have infiltrated the halls of corporate and political power. If you didn't already know, Icke's theory is that our world is currently being dominated by reptilian shapeshifters, basically reptile humanoid creatures who have the ability to disguise themselves as human by shapeshifting. Pretty far-fetched if you're coming from a traditional worldview. But what I find most startling is how David was able to come up with this theory, and how that theory matches up with mainstream scientific research. Obviously, the part about shape-shifting has nothing to do with scientific research, but the similarities between the reptilian brain and the reptilian shapeshifters are interesting. So I'm not convinced that shape-shifting reptiles have taken over the galaxy. I'm still not with David Icke on that. But I would say that David Icke might have maybe misinterpreted his intuition on this one. In the past, David discovers his epiphanies through mostly spiritual awakenings and intuitions, where he has a vision or some kind of intuitive feeling, and then he publishes those random intuitions only to find out 10 or 20 years later that mainstream science has confirmed what he said, like his theory on the universe being a holographic matrix, which is now mainstream scientific theory. So maybe David is only half right on his intuition about the reptilians. Maybe it's not reptilians taking over the world, but instead, maybe it's our reptilian brains taking over our lives. And if enough people succumb to the negative, destructive, fear-based qualities of our reptilian brains, then our society and the world will crumble into war, violence, and separation. The problem isn't necessarily that evil reptilians are outside of us and taking over the world. Maybe it's just the reptilian brain within us, which is responsible for aggression, dominance, territoriality, and ritual displays, that is the culprit here. I mean, all of those internet videos that claim to show proof of powerful leaders shape-shifting for a few moments to reveal their reptilian essence, maybe in a kind of metaphorical way, that's actually true. These evil sociopath leaders like Bush or Obama or any of these warmongering elitists, maybe they're not actually reptilians like David Icke says, but instead, maybe they are just slaves to the reptilian brain, the same part of the human brain that is responsible for aggression, dominance, territoriality, and ritual displays. From a scientific perspective, this is actually 100% accurate. It has been proven that the reptilian brain is the source of our most primal vicious qualities, so when a tyrant like Bush or past leaders exhibit qualities like war, dominance, and bloodlust, in a way you can say that they are reptilian. They are slaves to their reptilian brain. The good news, however, is that evolution seems to be taking us away from our reptilian past, and our brains have developed beyond the limitations of the reptilian brain. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 general sections of the brain, from an evolutionary perspective. The newest installment is called the neocortex, and it is the ultimate height of human evolution and potential. The neocortex is what truly separates us from the animal kingdom, and although many primates have a neocortex, they are nowhere near as developed as in humans. This part of the brain handles things like language, abstraction, planning, and perception. Sadly, the reptilian brain still persists, and it is oftentimes the source of our fears, worries, anxieties, depression, and even procrastination. World-famous thought leader and best-selling author Seth Godin has long talked about the reptilian brain and how it destroys human potential when it comes to life goals and what we want to accomplish.
You call the voice in our brain that keeps us from doing that lizard brain?
Right. So the amygdala, the Steve Pressfield's resistance, the voice of the lizard. And there's all sorts of ways I can show you this anecdotally, but I can also show it to you in the lab. So imagine caller ID, and you see from the caller, it's 10 o'clock Saturday night, that it's the chairman of the board of your company or your boss's boss. What happens? How long does it take for your heartbeat to start racing? Right? Did you have a whole calculation going through all the math, or did it happen instantly? It happens instantly. And we go from this person is calling to I'm in trouble to they figured out I'm truly a fraud to I'm going to be fired. I am never going to get another job because I'm going to be blackballed. I'm not going to have enough to eat. I'm going to die. And so caller ID to dead in less than a second. And we can prove this, right? That's not your conscious brain up here. That's the amygdala, the lizard brain. So a lot of people are uptight about writer's block. That Stephen King, the question he gets asked the most is, where do you get your ideas? We don't think writer's block exists. And our proof is that no one ever gets talker's block. No one wakes up in the morning going, right? Everyone manages to say something.
Yeah.
So how come when it's time to write it down, we freeze up? And Steve Pressfield calls this the resistance. If you're going to read one book after today, please go read The War of Art, or the shorter version, which I was lucky to publish, Do the Work. And Pressfield talks about the amygdala, which is right back here. If you go to a bio class here, you'll learn about it. It's the prehistoric brain. It's the brain dinosaurs had, lizards have, foxes have. It's the brain of a wild animal. We still have it. It's left over. It's the brain that kept us from getting eaten by a saber-toothed tiger back in the day. Well, that brain doesn't want to be held responsible. That brain doesn't want to be eaten. That brain doesn't want to be blamed. So when you take out a pen and have to say, I believe this, it gives you a reason not to. It comes up with an excuse. I don't have anything to say. I don't have any good ideas. Well, a minute ago, you were gabbing like crazy. Why were you, you know? So all I do is write down stuff that other people would have just said and that would have disappeared.
It seems clear to me that the reptilian brain is an outdated, primal, and pathetic relic hanging on for dear life. It wouldn't surprise me if the ego is a result of the R complex. The reptilian brain is fear, it is separation, it is ego, it is destruction and death and all the things we seek to move away from. But it is still there, like a splinter in our minds driving us mad. I don't know if David Icke is right about reptilian shapeshifters, but I do think we can all agree that the reptilians, whether world leaders in disguise or primitive parts of our brains, are a problem that we must strive to move away from.